A body buried nearly 100,000 years ago in a cave in Israel wasn't just laid to rest. It was covered in red powder, not scattered by accident. Not the result of soil chemistry playing tricks on archaeologists. Deliberately applied, deliberately chosen red ochre pressed into skin and bone before the earth closed over it. Someone took the time to do that. Someone thought it mattered enough to bother. That's where this story actually starts. And it's a strange place to start, because most people assume makeup is a modern obsession. A vanity thing, a mirror and Instagram thing. But ochre use goes back so far into human history that it predates language as we understand it, predates agriculture, predates almost everything we consider civilization. So the real question isn't when humans started wearing makeup. It's why a species barely surviving day to day would spend precious time and energy painting themselves at all. The obvious guess is vanity. People wanted to look good, so they figured out how to look good. Simple enough, except that explanation falls apart almost immediately. Once you look at the evidence, because the earliest confirmed uses of pigment on the human body weren't cosmetic in any romantic sense. They were functional, symbolic, and in some cases, deadly serious. Start with the ochre itself. Archaeologists have found processed ochre at sites like Blombos Cave in South Africa. Dating back roughly 100,000 years, some pieces engraved with deliberate crosshatch patterns, others ground down and mixed with other materials to create a usable paste. This wasn't raw rock. It was processed, refined, turned into something applicable. That takes planning. That takes intention. Early humans weren't stumbling onto colored dirt and rubbing it on themselves out of boredom. They were manufacturing pigment, and ochre has properties that go far beyond color. It's a natural sunscreen. The iron oxide in red ochre absorbs and reflects ultraviolet radiation, which matters enormously if you're a mostly hairless primate, living under equatorial sun for hours a day. Some researchers argue that ochre application may have started as practical skin protection, a way to prevent burns and reduce moisture loss in harsh, sun-heavy environments. It also has mild antimicrobial properties, which would have helped with wound care and insect deterrence. Two things that mattered enormously when a small cut or a persistent parasite bite could spiral into a life-threatening infection, with zero modern medicine available to fix it. So maybe the story isn't makeup at all in the beginning. Maybe it's sunscreen and bug spray that happened to leave people looking dramatically different. And somewhere along the way, humans noticed that difference and started attaching meaning to it. That's usually how these things work. Function comes first. Symbolism follows close behind. And then eventually the symbolism outlives the original function entirely. Because here's where it gets interesting. Red ochre shows up specifically and repeatedly at burial sites, across multiple continents and multiple time periods, in contexts that have nothing to do with sun protection. Neanderthal burial sites in Europe, early Homo sapiens graves in the Levant, ochre-covered skeletons found across Africa and Australia dating back tens of thousands of years. Red specifically appears again and again in death rituals, not blue, not green, red. Why red? The leading theory? And it's a genuinely compelling one, connects red pigment symbolically to blood and blood to life itself. Across dozens of unrelated ancient cultures with no contact with one another, red repeatedly represents vitality, fertility, danger, and death simultaneously. It's the color of a wound and the color of childbirth, the color of a kill and the color of a heartbeat. If early humans were trying to symbolically preserve life force in a body that no longer had any, red ochre makes a strange kind of emotional sense. You're not decorating a corpse. You're trying to keep something alive that everyone around you knows is already gone. That's a heavier reason to wear pigment than most people expect walking into this topic. But burial rituals only explain one slice of ancient pigment use. The living painted themselves too, constantly, for reasons that had nothing to do with mourning. And this is where the story shifts from spiritual to almost military in its logic. Body paint served as one of the earliest forms of group identification. Long before flags, before uniforms, before national symbols, humans needed a fast, visible way to answer a critical question in unfamiliar or dangerous encounters. Is this person part of my group or not in a world without written language, without standardized dress, without any of the modern markers we use to sort people into categories? A specific pattern of pigment across the face or chest could instantly communicate tribal affiliation. Anthropological studies of surviving hunter-gatherer societies, including groups in Papua New Guinea and parts of the Amazon, show remarkably consistent use of paint for exactly this purpose: territorial marking, warning displays, and instant visual identification of allies versus strangers. Think about how useful that actually is in a survival context. You're moving through unfamiliar territory. You spot another group in the distance. You have seconds to decide whether to approach, retreat, or prepare to fight. A recognizable painted pattern could mean the difference between a peaceful exchange and a deadly misunderstanding. Makeup, in this light, wasn't cosmetic. It was an early warning system, painted directly onto the body because there was nowhere else to put it. There's also strong evidence that pigment played a role in hunting itself, not just tribal identity. Some researchers point to soot and charcoal used around the eyes in various ancient and traditional cultures, as an early form of what's essentially anti-glare technology, similar to the black stripes modern athletes still put under their eyes today. Reducing glare from bright sunlight or reflective terrain like snow or water could give hunters a meaningful edge when tracking prey or waiting motionless for hours. It's a small advantage, but small advantages are exactly what separated a successful hunt from a starving week. Now here's where the story gets a little more uncomfortable, because pigment wasn't just about survival and identity. It was also, very early on, about power. Once humans started living in larger, more socially stratified groups, particularly with the rise of early agricultural societies, cosmetic use began splitting along social lines. Access to rare pigments, elaborate application techniques, or imported cosmetic materials became a way to visually signal status. In ancient Egypt, kohl wasn't just a beauty product. It was layered with religious meaning, medical function, and social hierarchy all at once, made from ground galena or other minerals. Kohl was applied heavily around the eyes by both men and women, and it served a genuinely practical purpose, reducing sun glare along the Nile and offering some antibacterial protection against the eye infections that were incredibly common in ancient Egyptian society due to dust, flies, and limited hygiene. But kohl also carried deep religious weight. It was associated with Horus and Ra, tied to protection from the evil eye, and used ceremonially on both the living and the dead. Archaeologists have found elaborate cosmetic palettes in Egyptian tombs dating back over 5,000 years, some belonging to men, some to women, some to children, suggesting cosmetic use wasn't gendered in the way modern audiences might assume. This wasn't a women's beauty routine. It was closer to a universal tool that intersected medicine, religion, status, and identity all at once. That gendered assumption people carry into this topic is actually one of the biggest misconceptions worth clearing up. For most of human history, and across most cultures, cosmetic and pigment use wasn't primarily a female practice. Warriors painted themselves before battle. Priests and shamans used specific colors and patterns during rituals. Male rulers across ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and parts of the Americas used elaborate cosmetics as a direct signal of divine authority or elevated status. The idea that makeup is inherently feminine is a relatively recent cultural narrowing, not a reflection of how ancient humans actually used it. So by the time you reach early civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, cosmetic use has already branched into at least 4 distinct functions operating simultaneously: practical protection from sun and infection, ritual and religious symbolism, social and status signaling, and tribal or group identification. That's an enormous amount of meaning packed into something as simple as colored powder on skin. And it's worth pausing here to acknowledge what we don't fully know. We can't ask a Neanderthal why they chose red ochre over another available pigment. We can't verify with certainty whether the earliest applications were primarily practical or primarily symbolic, because both explanations fit the available evidence and they likely coexisted rather than replacing one another in some neat linear progression. Some researchers argue the symbolic use came first, driven by early cognitive and social development. Others argue the practical benefits came first, and symbolism was layered on afterward. The honest answer is that we're reconstructing motivation from residue and burial patterns tens of thousands of years old, and total certainty simply isn't available. What is clear is that once humans started using pigment, they never really stopped, and the reasons kept multiplying rather than narrowing. By the time you get to ancient Greece and Rome, cosmetic use had expanded into elaborate skin whitening practices, using genuinely dangerous substances like lead-based powders, driven by class-based beauty standards where pale skin signaled wealth and status because it meant you didn't have to labor outdoors. That's a direct evolutionary line from ochre as sunscreen to lead-based powder as a status symbol. And it's a fairly dark one, since many wealthy Roman and later European women suffered genuine lead poisoning in pursuit of that pale, high-status look. Which brings us to something worth sitting with. The compounds and materials have changed dramatically. Nobody's grinding galena for eyeliner or mixing ochre with animal fat before a hunt anymore. But the underlying human behavior hasn't shifted nearly as much as it might seem. People still use cosmetics to signal group belonging, whether that's a specific subculture, a professional identity, or a social class. People still use color and pattern to communicate things about themselves before they ever speak a word. People still associate certain looks with status, health, and social power, the same way ancient elites once used rare pigments to separate themselves from everyone else. The materials evolved, the impulse didn't. So when you trace it all the way back, past Egyptian kohl, past Roman lead powder, past tribal warning paint, all the way to a burial site tens of thousands of years old, where someone pressed red ochre into the skin of a person who could no longer feel it, you find something that isn't really about beauty at all. It's about visibility, about being seen, categorized, protected, or remembered. Ancient humans didn't start wearing pigment because they wanted to look pretty for its own sake. They started because color applied to skin was one of the earliest tools humans had for saying something without saying anything at all. A warning, a status, a grief that had nowhere else to go. Long before we had words sophisticated enough to explain how we felt about life, death, belonging, and power, we had ochre, soot, and color pressed carefully onto the only surface we had available, ourselves.